A well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you for joining me here on another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to have you on board with us. Got a very busy day ahead of us. The Supreme Court meeting in conference today. We talked about this on yesterday's program. One of the cases they are set to consider is the case of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City. Now, they've already agreed to hear this case. What they're considering is whether or not the case is now moot since New York City and New York State have changed their laws. The plaintiffs in this case, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, arguing that no, there are still some live issues here before the court. We will probably not know the results of this conference until next Monday. The Supreme Court is one of those institutions in Washington, D.C. that rarely, if ever, leaks. And so generally speaking, what happens is the orders for the previous week's conference are distributed at 9:30 the following Monday. So conference held today, and then next Monday, 9:30, we'll get the orders from today's conference, and we should know whether or not that case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City, is going to proceed to oral arguments on December the 2nd. Now, on the first day of October, there are some new laws going into effect around the country, and in Florida, it's a big step, I believe, towards increased school safety. Some Florida teachers now able to carry on the job. This has been a long time coming. In the aftermath of the shootings in Parkland, Florida, Florida instituted what was called the Guardian Program, which allowed for basically any school staff other than classroom teachers to volunteer, to be vetted, to undergo training, and then they could carry while they were on the job. And now this has officially been expanded so that teachers and educators can take part in the Guardian Program as well. CBS News, covering the story, they spoke with the superintendent in Bay County, Florida, Bill Husfeldt, who says, we don't look at it as we want more guns, we look at it as we want more protection. The superintendent, by the way, back in 2010, had a gun pointed at him when a guy walked into a school board meeting, firing at Husfeldt and others. He missed and was shot by a security guard before he took his own life. Husfeldt said, experiencing that myself put a different spin on it and a different understanding about what goes on in those situations. He says, unless you're standing in front of somebody with a gun pointed at you, you don't realize how helpless you really are. We've got a story of bearing arms today. As a matter of fact, we're going to be talking tomorrow with a school board member in Beaufort County, South Carolina, who wants to be able to carry her legally carried and legally owned firearm at school board meetings because there was some concern about, and maybe even an attempt to drop security for the meetings. And her point was, listen, if we don't have a sheriff's deputy here, then we've got no protection because under South Carolina law, we're not allowed to carry in these public meetings. So she wants to change that. She noted that there have been cases before, including this one in Bay County, Florida, where you've had individuals come in intent on doing harm. And of course, we know that sadly and rarely, but still tragically, there are individuals who seek out innocent lives in schools to try to do as much damage as possible. And every time I talk about armed teachers in the classrooms online, I get an earful from teachers who are opposed to this. And typically the argument goes, nobody wants this. No teacher wants this. And I'll point out that, well, actually some teachers do, because there's, thousands of educators that have already been trained in places like Ohio and Colorado and Wyoming and elsewhere. So, yeah, not every teacher is opposed to this idea. And then the argument generally shifts to, well, we're not getting paid to do that. We're getting paid to teach. It's not part of our job responsibility, which is I think a really bad argument. And the response that I usually give is, so if you saw a kid choking in the classroom, would you not do anything to help? Because that's not your job. Your job is to educate. Now, again, not every teacher's got to know CPR. Right? Not every teacher's going to know the Heimlich maneuver, but those who do, I would think, would step up and try to help out in that situation. Well, same goes again for being that first line of defense for students. Not every teacher is going to want to do it. And that's fine. Nobody should have to take part in the armed teacher program if they don't want to. The good news is that in districts around the country that have adopted these policies, I'm not aware of any district that voted to have armed school staff and then said, well, we can't because we haven't had any volunteers. We haven't had anybody actually apply and say they're willing to do this. Instead, what generally happens is that they have to turn people away. Like, yeah, we've got enough, or we can only provide training for so many this year. So, hopefully next year we'll be able to expand it. But it's not been a matter of, lifting up every rock and looking in the corner of the classrooms, trying to find the educators that are willing to take that step, again, to be that first line of defense for those kids in school and for their coworkers as well. So again, this is now the law in the state of Ohio. Critics, and there are critics, again, have some concerns here. Tony Montalto lost his daughter, Gina, in the Parkland shooting. Debbie Hickson, her husband, Chris, was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas athletic director. And she said, quote, teachers should not be burdened, whether they think they want to or not, with the responsibility of worrying about carrying a firearm. So in other words, even if they don't think it's a burden, and they shouldn't have to carry, or perhaps they shouldn't carry. According to CBS, they argue that mental health programs and responsible firearm ownership are better deterrents to mass shootings, and that armed personnel should remain outside the classroom. Montalto says, we do believe in the Guardian program. We do believe in school resource officers. We do believe in having trained officers on the campus. We need an armed person on campus able and willing to react properly. There's nothing wrong with that either. As a matter of fact, we've done some research. We have not done research. We've done interviews with James Eric Dietz, who is the director of the Homeland Security Institute at Purdue University. And a couple of years ago, they released a study showing that their computer modeling demonstrated that the most effective way to stop an active assailant in a school setting was to have that armed school resource officer who was there on scene, who could respond and actively seek out that attacker. Well, at the same time, they found they used 15%, is what they found. 15% of the faculty armed and sheltering in place with their students, that those two things, one, a school resource officer who could go and pursue that attacker, and then two, a body of armed school staff sheltering in place with their students in case somebody came through that door, they could respond, that stopped the attack in the shortest amount of time possible. And that really is what it's about. So I don't think that there's, there are some people who say, no, we shouldn't have armed school resource officers. There is that argument. We'll revisit that argument another day. But the argument of, well, we should have armed police, but that's all we should have, I disagree respectfully. But again, the data and common sense tells us that the more opportunities there are to protect those kids, the more individuals there are who are able to protect those kids, while there are also individuals out there who are pursuing and attempting to engage that active assailant, that is going to save as many lives as possible. Speaking of saving lives, the FBI out with its uniform crime report for 2018. And good news, barely reported by the national media, FBI says murder and violent crime both declined in 2018. Yeah, again, that's great news. We didn't hear much about it yesterday. You might not have heard anything at all about it if you didn't visit bearingarms.com. New York Times, I saw, had a story talking about the drop in violent crime. But hours after this had been reported by the FBI, there was still nothing at CNN or NBC News. This was, largely ignored by the media. And as we pointed out at Bearing Arms yesterday, most Americans, year in, year out, doesn't matter what the crime stats show, most Americans believe that violent crime is getting worse. Why is that? Because of the media. Because of the if it bleeds, it leads coverage of the media. And the media collectively spent thousands of people hours on yesterday's broadcast covering crime stories. And they probably spent a collective 45 minutes talking about the fact that violent crime dropped by almost 4% last year, that homicides dropped by 6.2% last year. And our violent crime rate right now in the United States is the lowest that it has been since 1970. I think there was 1 year in like 2014 where the violent crime rate was roughly equivalent to where we are now in 2019. But we're sitting at 50-year lows in terms of violent crime in this country. That's an amazing story. Now, it might be more complicated to tell the story of crimes that aren't being committed if you're a member of the media, right? How do you cover a crime that wasn't committed? And it's difficult. But one of the things that you can do is you can report on stories just like this. And you can point out that, actually we're getting safer in this country. And by the way, getting safer while we are adding more privately owned firearms to the mix. In 1999, when the violent crime rate was a lot higher, there were a total of 9,138,123 NICS checks performed. In 2018, that number had grown to 26,181,936 checks. Now, not every check equals a firearm sale, but pretty clearly, over the last 20 years, Americans are owning more firearms. We are carrying far more firearms. And the violent crime rate is a lot less than it was 20 years ago. Again, sitting at near 50-year lows. I think that's worth talking about. I think that is worth covering. All right, let's get to our armed citizen story. Actually, we'll get to our armed citizen story. We'll get to our good deed of the day. But, every day we do a story from the failed criminal justice system, right? These plea deals that happen time and time again. And you can find these stories in your local paper. I got to give credit to a media outlet that I think is just doing a fantastic job here. In Charlotte, North Carolina, the Charlotte Observer has a new series out. This is a 4-part series called Dismissed. And here's the big headline from part 1. Prosecutors drop gun charges over and over. Some suspects go on to kill. Mario McGill, 2012. Broke into a home in Charlotte, shot a man in the leg. Accused of firing a gun the next year near a woman's foot. Year after that, slammed the same woman to the ground, pointed a gun at her. Prosecutors dismissing all 3 cases, saying the evidence was weak, and they say prosecutors, McGill was used to that. From 2007 to 2014, 13 consecutive weapons charges were dismissed against Mario McGill. Now think about that for a second. We've got all these politicians running around on the Democratic side of the aisle. Oh, we need these new gun laws. We need more gun laws. We need more gun laws. And each and every one of these gun laws aimed at people who are right now legal gun owners. Well, we think you should have to go through universal background checks. Well, we think that you should have your guns taken away if we believe that you might pose a threat to yourself or others. We believe that you need a license to own a firearm. We believe that you need to register your firearms. We believe that we need to limit the number of firearms you can own to 1 per month. Meanwhile, what's happening to people who are actually using firearms in the commission of violent crimes? Nothing. A big, fat nothing is happening. More from the Charlotte Observer. Cases like McGill's, they write, have contributed to an alarming statistic. Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, prosecutors between 2014 and 2018 dismissing 68% of weapons charges. 2/3 of the time that somebody gets arrested, and again, may very well be an underlying violent crime too, those charges are getting dismissed. Half of all weapons charges during the 5-year period statewide were dismissed. I mean, this is amazing. And, the Charlotte Observer, their 4-part series there, I mean, these are the names of the 4 parts, right? Suspects go free, preventable murders, repeat suspects. And then part 4, solutions. Well, the solution is to actually start charging some of these folks. The solution is to enforce the laws that are on the books as opposed to turning millions, tens of millions of currently legal law-abiding Americans into criminals. And yet, this is never brought up on a Democratic debate stage. Now, I don't think we have any presidential candidates running from North Carolina at the moment. I know we've still got several dozen of them, but I don't think any are from North Carolina. And I don't think the next debate's going to be in North Carolina. So this story won't get brought up. Maybe it'll get brought up locally. But this isn't just a Mecklenburg issue. This isn't just a North Carolina issue. This is an issue across the country where time and time again, charges are either dismissed, they're null prost, or far more common, a plea bargain is offered and accepted. And, again, a slap on the wrist for somebody who is eligible for 5, 10, 15, 20 years behind bars. So if you get the opportunity, and this is one of the segments on the program that you, I won't say enjoy, but to get your blood pressure up each and every time we talk about, one of these criminals who goes scot-free, observer.com, actually charlotteobserver.com, and look up Dismissed, that 4-part series. It is absolutely amazing. We may even touch on it later on in the week. In fact, I might even reach out to the reporters and see if they can join us on the program. Ames Alexander, Gavin Off, and David Rayner are the reporters there. And again, kudos to the Charlotte Observer. Kudos to these reporters. It is, it's easy to bag on the media these days. It's easy to talk about what a crummy job they do. So when you see really, really good reporting, we need to be able to call that out too and acknowledge a job well done. All right, let's get to our armed citizen story of the day. All right, there's our armed citizen story. I knew I had it somewhere. Hot Springs, Arkansas, where 2 individuals chased off after a attempted home invasion by an armed homeowner. Yeah, this happened the other night. I guess it was it was a week ago. 18-year-old Dwayne Marvin Johnson and 20-year-old Wintrell VaQuint Coleman, both now charged with 1 count of aggravated residential burglary, which is punishable, by the way, up to a life in prison in Arkansas. Apparently the pair had no idea who lived in this home, but they had heard that there were pounds of marijuana inside. And so they decided, let's steal it, and allegedly kicked in the front door of the place. The homeowner was armed and told the pair, I have a gun and I've called police. And all of a sudden the 2 had somewhere else they needed to be. When police arrived a few moments later, they ended up finding one of these suspects crouched down behind a nearby house. They also were able to recover a 9mm pistol where that individual had been crouching down. Second suspect found in a field behind the homeowner's house. No shots fired, but the homeowner is okay. And those alleged armed intruders, again, now facing the potential life in prison because they thought they found an easy score. All right, let's get to today's good deed of the day. This little guy, 5-year-old Maddox Gates. He's from Georgia, and he and his family were on vacation. They were in Indiana, driving down the highway, and Maddox had some issues. Started choking. WSB reports that Jill Gates, Maddox's mom, said he had fallen asleep, and then we looked back, he kind of woken up, he made a noise, like a choking noise, like he was going to throw up, and I tried to get him to throw up into the bag, because every parent on a car trip has that bag, right? And she said he just dropped, and he kind of threw up all over himself, and then I was calling his name, and he wasn't responding to me. His eyes were kind of over to the side and glazed over a little bit. So Maddox's dad, Brad, pulls over, calls 911. He said, to see your child like that, he said, I almost feel helpless to an extent. He's not responding. You don't know what the cause is. Jill's freaking out. She says, we're in the middle of nowhere on the highway. She said, but it's like we had these angels watching over us. One of those angels, Ben Reasons, who is a Indiana State Trooper. He was headed home from work when he heard the radio call. Jill said he seemed to appear out of nowhere The officer giving him the Heimlich at the time. Maddox regained consciousness. They were able to transport him to a local hospital. After just a few hours, he was cleared to leave, and the Gates were able to get back on the road. He's back home in Georgia. Jill Gates says we can't thank Trooper Reasons enough for stopping and doing what he did. I mean, again, in the right place, at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. Trooper Ben Reasons there in the Hoosier state of Indiana, we thank you, sir, for your very good deed. And that is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Again, tomorrow we'll talk with that school board member in South Carolina who would like to be able to carry a firearm for her protection and the protection of everybody else in the room at the school board meetings. We'll have the latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation as well. And of course, you can get that all throughout the day at bearingarms.com. You can find us as a podcast on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, townhall.com podcast. You can subscribe to Town Hall Media as well, and to make sure that you don't miss an episode of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Thank you so much for being a part of the program, for watching and for listening and for spreading the word. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company.